Hello everyone, I'm Elfowls, and welcome to another match analysis for the Newport Noctowls in Season 12 of the Whooper Club League. Last time I covered my Week 9 match against the Waterdeep Wobbuffets, where I finished off the regular season with an undefeated 8-0 record. This time we're in the playoffs as the first seed facing off in the conference semifinals, or rather the overall quarterfinals, against Greg and his 4th seed Quiet Majesty. And since we did play everyone in the conference during the regular season, this is a rematch. I played Greg in Week 2 and came away with a 5-0 victory, thanks in part to Tyranitar and Dondozo's walling efforts, as well as Great Tusk grabbing 5 KOs with an endgame sweep. It was actually a pretty good matchup last time, and it's the same matchup again, but Greg's team remains quite threatening. Let's go over it one more time. Starting from the top, we have that Meowscarada, followed up by Lycanroc Dusk, Palmot, Espathra, Mismagius, Garchomp that cannot Terra, Chi-Yu that also cannot Terra, Cetitan, Sarina, Sylveon, and Toxapex. There's a lot of offense here. Greg has shown off the raw power of Chi-Yu throughout the whole season, and I think he's also started to recognize the sweeping potential of Espathra, and those two can either be stacked on top of ridiculous offense with Garchomp, Meowscarada, and Palmot, or supported by the defensive pivoting of Toxapex, Sylveon, and Sarina. It looks like a pretty offensive team, and the speed tiering is a bit more exploitable than usual, but the ability to swap between offensive and defensive backbones does make the team a pretty adaptable squad. One thing that is not very adaptable is Cetitan, which is still walled by Dondozo, can't easily get past Azumarill, and can't sweep with Slush Rush because I do have another weather to counteract it with Sand. It would take a lot to make Cetitan a big threat in this matchup, and I just don't think that's worth it. Everything else is at least decently viable in the matchup, but Mismagius is next. Once again, a wall to Great Tusk's dual stabs and a decent special attacker, but there's some significant overlap between it and the other special attackers on Greg's team, so I'm kind of naturally prepared for this already. Greg could try to stack this alongside Chi-Yu and Espathra to overwhelm my special walls, but I don't know if that's worth the trouble. Likewise, I think Lycanroc falls into that same mold. A lot of overlap with other physical offense, so I think this is kind of redundant outside of being a pressure piece with Priority Accelerock. Once again, I think Greg could stack this alongside other physical attackers to overwhelm my physically defensive core, but that doesn't really change how I'm preparing for this matchup anyway. And then Sarina did show up last time as a more defensive grass type to complement Meowscarada's grass type offense, but it did fall to Great Tusk anyway thanks to some chip damage and a couple of ice spinners. It still obviously has good traits in the matchup, like that good damage onto Great Tusk and the water types that I have, and also Rapid Spin. But that grass type offense that I'm afraid of is just outclassed by Meowscarada, so I'm not really worried about this too much. And lastly, on the missed list, we have Palmot, which did show up last time with the Choice Band, and it was surprisingly strong and hard to switch into. That's still the case. A set of strong attacks combined with the possibility of Revival Blessing makes this a pain to play around, and if anything from my predicted top 6 doesn't show, I'm expecting Palmot to be there in its place. That said, I do think each member of his top 6 is just too important to the game plan for Greg to leave behind. One major part of this is Espathra, which Greg didn't bring last time against me, but I think he should this time. I do have a decent matchup against this, with Tyranitar and Unaware Dondozo to stave it off a little bit, but Espathra's ability to just steal games under the right circumstances is kind of ridiculous. A max HP spread can set up with Calm Mind and Speed Boost with Protect against most of my team, and from there it can sweep with Stored Power and Coverage move. If I have to guess, probably Terra Blast Fighting for perfect neutral coverage as well as heavy damage on Tyranitar. After our last time facing off, I think Greg's going to want that extra win condition to get the edge this time. I think that will be supported pretty well by Sylveon, a natural answer to the dark types that I need to prevent an Espathra sweep. Sylveon is a decent switch into Tyranitar, which is otherwise pretty good in the matchup, and it completely stonewalls Hydreigon with a Wish set, making my Dragon borderline unusable outside of being a U-turn button. Its matchup outside of that is admittedly pretty shaky. Iron Moth is a pretty hard counter outside of the unlikely Psyshock coverage, and Great Tusk bowls right over it with Heavy Slam, as we saw in Week 2, but its utility and counter matchups do warrant a spot on the team. And then we have Toxapex, which is the main defensive piece that I need to be prepared to break through. It is passive, but I'll need to make sure that in the trade war, I can keep pieces alive that have the ability to damage this thing, because Toxapex stall is a legitimate endgame for Greg if I only have things like Azumarill or Pivot Hydreigon or Iron Moth left standing. More likely though, this will just be a pivot piece that can switch in pretty safely on Azumarill, Iron Moth, Dondozo, and others. I'll have to make sure I can hit it hard and pivot around it well. And that leaves us with the 3 big immediate damage dealers, starting with Garchomp. Is there a safe switch into this? The best I got is Azu or Dondozo, but even those are shaky. Draco Meteor off of its decent special attack means that Dondozo technically isn't safe, and it also cuts off any other physically defensive answers I have. Meanwhile, Azu switches in on dragon moves all day, but Max Attack Earthquake does a lot of damage, and with a choice band on it, that could be even more devastating. So learning the set is going to have to be my priority if I want to figure out a safe switch in, but while I'm trying to figure that out, it might just rip through my team, set up a Swords Dance, or just set up several layers of spikes and Stealth Rock. Gross. At least this can't Terra out of its Ice and Fairy weaknesses, but taking advantage of that is going to be a little tough with that Toxapex right behind it. Up next, Chi-Yu. It's insane how much damage this can do to even defensive resists. Luckily, my matchup against it is great, like I've said before, with several bulky resists, but Chi-Yu becomes a great late game piece if the rest of the team can break through its natural checks. Specifically, I think Greg is going to try to find ways to force T-Tar in and take it out before Chi-Yu comes in for its breaking opportunity. And lastly, I am still very concerned about Meowscarada. It threatens out a lot of my team and doesn't have that many safe switch-ins. Fortress is probably the best defensive answer on paper, but as we saw in the last battle, it only takes one knockoff to start getting Fortress chipped down into dangerous levels. I'm going to have to be careful about preventing this thing from sweeping through most of my team. If anything, I think Greg's path to victory this time will either be with Chi-Yu wearing down my defensive core enough for Espathra to break through, or with Garchomp chunking down my physical tanks into Meowscarada range. So I'll need a specific game plan to prevent either of those win conditions. That starts by benching Farigiraf, which really only helps out against Mismagius and I guess Toxapex, and not much else. Espathra boosts right past me and everything else just hits too hard. I'm also going to pass on Rotom-Mow, which could be a decent defensive switch into certain threats, but I'm not confident in many of its matchups. It's a good Earthquake immunity for Garchomp, but I'm expecting fire coverage from that, and it resists Grass from Meowscarada, but gets smacked hard by U-Turn. I have some better resists to these moves, so it'll be a no on Rotom. Hydreigon also falls into the same boat. It has some good resistances, including a ground immunity and a resist to Chi-Yu's dual stabs, but Chi-Yu is one of the only matchups it really likes to see, with so many Pokemon right above that base 100 benchmark that outspeed and hit it super effectively, not to mention the Sylveon that can switch in so easily. I'm sure there's a way to make Hydreigon work, but it's just not worth the trouble for me. And that leaves us with a few Pokemon that I did bring last time, but neither actually touched the field. Yeah, Polteageist looked like a potential setup threat in front of Toxapex, but I don't really believe in that setup opportunity anymore. If Greg is bringing Toxapex, it's probably got Haze, and with how offensive Greg's team is otherwise, I don't really see any other time to Shell Smash, other than maybe on Sylveon, and even that's a little shaky, so no Polteageist. And then that leaves me with Iron Moth on the bench, which means my second and third draft picks will not be showing up today. I brought this last time with a weird Acid Spray set to catch its defensive switch-ins, and that was mostly a gimmick to try and grab a good matchup where I really don't think one exists. Iron Moth's stabs aren't great here, requiring specific coverage moves for both Garchomp and Toxapex, and even with those, we lose most of the time to Meowscarada, get scared out by Lycanroc, and Espathra might even see this as setup fodder, unless I bring Acid Spray again. No, I just see 6 better Pokemon for the matchup this time. The team is mostly going to be the same as last time, but with a few important changes to choke out my opponent's win conditions. So I'm going to start with the 2 changes I made to my roster to help out more against Meowscarada. The first slot is Azumarill, which is specifically built as a counter lead for the fairly likely Meowscarada to bait it into Flower Chick, survive with the Rindo Berry, and KO with Ice Spinner in return. The game plan in that matchup is to protect first and scout out the Protein typing, and then on the next turn, click Ice Spinner if it's a Grass type from using Flower Chick, or Play Rough if it turned into a Dark type trying to catch the switch out. That only leaves us with 1 move slot, but I am just fine going Aqua Jet and no Liquidation as the water coverage of choice, since the only Liquidation target would really be Chi-Yu, and Play Rough into Aqua Jet KOs that anyway. I mean, Aqua Jet alone KOs that after a round of Stealth Rock, so yeah, I'm not too worried about it. Outside of the Meowscarada matchup, Azumarill is a pretty great check to Garchomp and Chi-Yu, so the matchup looks great. I didn't bring Azu last time, fearing the Toxapex matchup, but honestly, if Toxapex is the automatic switch-in to take Play Rough, I can take advantage of that with my own double switch out. It's not really Azu's job to break through 3s anyway, this is mostly a tech Meowscarada lure, but if I get into an endgame with Toxapex out of the picture, Azumarill looks great there too. The EV spread is pretty standard max attack, with enough HP to take a modest Specs overheat from Chi-Yu, and the remainder is dumped into defense to better tank physical hits from Meowscarada and Garchomp. And the Terra type is Water. Once again, I'm not too interested in Terra on Azumarill, but stronger Aqua Jets could be helpful in a pinch. So that's a decent way to remove Meowscarada from the game early, but I'd also like a good switch into it, and Fortress can't necessarily do that over the course of an entire match, so here's my other roster change with Kilowattrel, which is appearing for the first time since week 1 of the regular season. This is still an offensive spread with enough speed to outrun Meowscarada, but we've got enough defense investment to take almost any hit from Jolly Choice Band Meowscarada. Knockoff from that set is a roll though. So this should hopefully be able to switch in on anything the cat wants to do, and then roost off the damage before it can do anything else, so it's a more resilient answer than Fortress. As for the other move slots, Volt Switch is great momentum and also safely hits Toxapex hard, especially with the Magnet boost, and Hurricane is the other spammable stab that gets pretty good coverage in the matchup. After the last move slot, I was thinking about U-turn and then replacing Volt Switch with Thunderbolt to be able to pivot out of a Garchomp switch in, but I decided that I would rather just Hurricane Garchomp for the damage. And so in the last free move slot, this was completely filler at first, but I actually liked the idea of Eerie Impulse to harshly lower special attack in front of Calm Mind Sylveon or Espathra. I very much doubt that's going to come up, but it's a nice emergency button if I need it. We also have Volt Absorb as the ability, which makes Kilowattrel a great switch in to Palmot's dual stabs, and Terra Flying makes Hurricane strong enough to 2-hit KO max HP Garchomp. I really like the amount of offensive utility packed into this set. Hopefully Kilowattrel proves itself after a season spent mostly on the bench. So moving on, I have 4 movesets that should look pretty familiar if you've seen my last match against Greg, but there have been some key changes made. So let's start with maybe the most important glue piece, Tyranitar. And it really is crazy that despite having 2 other resists to Chiyu's dual stabs, my Chiyu matchup would be so much worse without this. I ran a Chesto Rest set last time, but I actually would like even more longevity in the face of that Chiyu, so we're going with Rest Talk to safely heal up multiple times over the course of the battle. And I'll be so bold as to claim that Rest Talk Tyranitar might just be the best answer to Chiyu in the game. It resists every move it could use with massive special defense under Sand, and it can threaten immediate KO back with Rock Blast. It's my switch into Chiyu every time, and it's even a decent check to Espathra with my favorite addition to the set with Dragon Tail. This is probably going to be what I click in front of Chiyu to punish a switch and rack up Sand Chip on multiple Pokemon, but consider that with max special defense, Tyranitar can actually survive Espathra's +1 Terra Fighting Terra Blast, and then we can just phase it out with Dragon Tail. I don't really want to have to do that since T-Tar is my best Chiyu damage sponge, but it's a great option to have regardless. Lastly, we are Terra Rock, which sheds a few extra weaknesses and boosts up the power of Rock Blast, but I really don't see myself using this one either, since T-Tar's dual typing looks too good in this matchup to give up. That's probably the piece that's changed the most since last time. The last 3 really just have minor adjustments. For example, Dondozo is still Rest Talk with the same EV spread, but the other 2 moves have been swapped out. We're missing Liquidation and Avalanche for coverage, instead grabbing Earthquake for a better matchup into Toxapex, and Yawn for more pseudo-hazing against the likes of Espathra and other setup sweepers. That's the main point of Dondozo, switching in on things like Cetitan, Lycanroc, Swords Dance Garchomp, and Espathra if they ever get out of hand, and forcing them out with Yawn. Once again, the EVs are built to avoid the 2-hit KO from Garchomp's uninvested Draco Meteor, and the rest is invested towards being the best physically defensive wall we can beat. And Terra Dark with Unaware is my best shot at dealing with Espathra. In fact, if Espathra does show up, I'm probably holding back on using my Terra options until the bird reveals itself, just to make absolutely sure I have the option of going Terra Dark Dondozo to counter it. Just like last time, this is basically my anti-setup insurance policy, pretty basic but hopefully pretty effective. Up next is another very familiar face, with Great Tusk rocking the same exact set as last time, once again a very threatening sweeper. We outspeed Meowscarada after a Rapid Spin boost, and with max attack Adamant, our 3-move coverage of Headlong Rush, Ice Spinner, and Heavy Slam gets amazing coverage into my opponent's team. The only difference here is that the item is now Expert Belt, since 8 of the 11 Pokemon on my opponent's side are hit super effectively with this moveset, which is just crazy. That actually means that against most Sylveon sets, I won't even need a Terra Steel to 1-hit KO with Heavy Slam. That is still the Terra option though, since it trades out the Glare and Grass weakness in this matchup for a resist, turning Meowscarada into a potential setup opportunity. I know that Greg might be more wary of it this time, but this is still an excellent matchup for a Great Tusk sweep. And lastly, tying the team together, we have Fortress, which is once again a nice switch into Espathra, Toxapex, Sylveon, and Meowscarada. But with Kilowattrel as my more dedicated Meowscarada answer, Fortress has a lot less pressure on it for that matchup, so I feel a lot more free to bring this as a pivot through those other matchups. This is probably my singular best switch into Toxapex and Sylveon, since neither can do much damage to me, and I can get the slow pivot out with Volt Switch, set up rocks as my only hazard remover in the matchup, or spin away any hazards that may have been set up on my side. Gyro Ball hits a few matchups hard, but it's mainly for Espathra, and so is my Terra type, which is Psychic. This is the only type that keeps a resistance to stored power while also picking up that fighting resistance, which, like I said, is the Terra type I'm expecting from that thing. So, that's going to be the team. I put a lot more emphasis on beating Meowscarada and Espathra than last time, the two best win conditions I think Greg has. I think I prepared well. Let's see if it's enough. Okay, I was almost correct, but oddly enough, no Garchomp, with Lycanroc here instead. Fair enough, I guess. Great Tusk did use Garchomp as setup fodder last time, but I don't know. I'm pretty happy to see it not here, considering I have a couple of easy Lycanroc switch-ins. Also of note is that Greg has no hazard removal this time without that Serena around, so I'll be looking to get my rocks up fairly early, but Azumarill was the planned lead in case of a Meowscarada lead, so let's start with that for now. Good luck, have fun to Greg in the quarterfinals. It's the Lycanroc lead. Not exactly the matchup I was fishing for, but I'll certainly take this. Azumarill should win this every time, and if I'm Greg, I'm probably looking to avoid this matchup, so a switch out feels obvious. And I don't even have to think twice about what switch is in here. Toxapex is the automatic answer, so Fortress is mine. Yep, this is a free rock setup. Sylveon is gonna come in as I click Stealth Rock, and those are up permanently. Okay, well, Sylveon has kind of an interesting switch in. I'm not sure why it's here, but I'm not too afraid of it, so I'll just get the slow Volt Switch out. Hyper Voice, that's not bad damage, and my Volt Switch does reveal that this is probably a specially defensive set based on that roll. I suppose then that Great Tusk could be the answer here with Heavy Slam, but if there's any significant defense investment, then I need some chip damage to stick onto this Sylveon first, so I made this switch kind of an interesting decision to bring in T-Tar, mostly to set up this Sand, which will negate that Leftovers recovery and keep Sylveon just below max HP. I'd like to keep some chip on it. There's no shot I stay in here, though. Tyranitar's health needs to be preserved for the Chi-Yu sitting in the back. So, back to Fortress, I guess. But that is just on the wish. And since I would actually prefer Sylveon to have some damage on it, I'm just going to go for Gyro Ball in case it decides to stay in and heal up. But instead, that is just a Baton Pass. And that's a smart switch into Chi-Yu. It does take Rocks, Gyro Ball, and then Sandstorm damage, but the Wish does heal back to full. Okay, well, I know it isn't Boots, which is nice with the rocks up. Regardless, T-Tar is my pretty obvious switch-in on Reflect. Oh, that's interesting. I like the initiative Greg took here to set something up rather than attack the obvious T-Tar. I wonder if this is a Light Clay set? That would make sense if it's not Boots. As for the next turn, though, I'm very much willing to bet that Greg won't keep Chi-Yu in here, so my play is always to Dragon Tail and punish any switch-in that isn't Sylveon, which I'm really hoping doesn't come in. It's not the Sylveon, but rather the aggressive Meowscarada switch, which takes Rocks and Dragon Tail into Toxapex. I do really like the chip damage on it, and I also have an easy follow-up play into Toxapex with my own wall Fortress. Now, we aren't going to take too much from Liquidation, and I'm guessing Greg doesn't have anything productive to do in this matchup because he hard switches to Meowscarada, as I just get my slow pivot out to my best Meowscarada check in Kilowattrel. And with Lycanroc as the only quote-unquote flying resist, Hurricane looks very free to go for. I'll just fire that off into the Sylveon. That's decent damage, but it definitely confirms a specially defensive spread on this. It also confuses, which could be helpful, we'll see. And also of note, Reflect is still up now, which confirms that the Chi-Yu's item is Light Clay. But anyway, here I'm Volt Switching right out to Fortress, getting some nice damage as the Wish goes up. And because Sylveon is at about half, I'm fully expecting it to stay in and keep that Wish for itself. And Gyro Ball is an option to keep it at below full health, I suppose, but that's actually not doing much damage to Sylveon, so staying in means that repeated wishes probably will out-heal the damage I'm doing. So I'm just going to Volt Switch out. A Hyper Voice does go off for some chip, but at least I can bring T-Tar in for Sand Chip. Once again, I'd really like that chip damage before ensuring Great Tusk can take Sylveon out, so that's my motivation for keeping the Sand up here. But just like last time, I need to preserve Tyranitar, so I guess Fortress is going to be my pivot through again. So we're coming in Hyper Voice. That chip is starting to build up. We're at about half after this one, and that isn't the worst thing in the world. Most of my team is still pretty healthy, but in this moment I feel like I've been bouncing between T-Tar and Fortress a little too much for not too much gain. So instead of Volt Switching, I'm just going to hit with Gyro Ball and see what happens. But, of course, it's Toxapex. It's going to eat that up. But this is a pretty darn free Volt Switch. Liquidation does unfortunate chip, but I think it's time to bring in a big threat finally. Great Tusk looks primed to hit a massive Headlong Rush here. Or rather, it would. I took a second here to think about Greg's options on this turn. Looking at his team, I don't see a switch into the ground move, which is actually pretty cool, so probably not a switch. So if he stays in with Toxapex and just clicks an attack, he's just sacking Toxapex. He could Terrasilize to survive a hit, but that would actually be pretty ill-advised. I would actually love to see a Terra Toxapex if it means Espathra in the back can't Terra. So Headlong Rush feels pretty good, right? Well, there is one other possibility. Baneful Bunker would protect the Toxapex for a turn while also poisoning Great Tusk. And given that this is probably my best win condition in the matchup, I really don't want this guy getting poisoned. All of this is to say that instead of going for the obvious Headlong Rush, I'm going to scout things out first with a switch to Fortress. And it was just a Toxic, probably trying to punish a Rapid Spin setup. No Baneful Bunker, no Terra. Yeah, this was a pretty unnecessary play, I'll admit. I'll just take the Liquidation, I guess, with Fortress, and pivot right back out with a Volt Switch. And now that I'm sure there's no hidden counterplay, I'm just going to come in with Great Tusk. Headlong Rush is the move to take out Toxapex, and we're going to move up to a 6-5 game state. That actually opened up Azumarill quite a bit, which should just be claiming a KO the next time it's safely in. Curiously though, the revenge is not going to be Meowscarada, but instead Sylveon. That's kind of interesting. Greg should know that I have Heavy Slam, and based on the spread that I think he is, that should just be KOing from here. But Greg had to have some reason to bring this in, right? There's got to be some kind of trick to this? Maybe a Terra Fire to live the Steel move and KO back? I'm scouting with Fortress again, just to be sure. Okay, just a plain old Hyper Voice. Alright, I think it's safe to say that I'm being entirely too cautious here. Like I said with Toxapex, him going for Terra while I attack would mostly just be good for me, just to make sure that Espathra wouldn't Terra later for coverage. As it stands though, I've wasted most of Fortress' remaining health to make sure Great Tusk is safe, and these plays have really been overkill. I guess I'm not going to be punished too hard though, because Fortress does actually have enough health to survive the next Hyper Voice at 2%, and then pivot back out to Great Tusk. And yes, it is time. A Heavy Slam should squash this Sylveon. And yes, that's the easy KO for a 6-4 game. Funnily enough, I haven't switched moves with Great Tusk yet, so I wonder if Greg thinks I'm locked in with a Choice Band. I've definitely been playing as if I am, so who knows, that could be a decent bluff for later. But anyway, it's Meowscarada as the revenge, so I'm switching out to my dedicated check. Kilowattrel is going to come in on the Flower Trick, doing just under half and revealing the Life Orb. And Volt Switch looks like it actually gets a kill here, so might as well go with the accurate option to take it. Meowscarada is going to move first with the Sucker Punch, but my bird is bulky enough to take that, and we do take the KO. That is a 6-3 game, and I have multiple dedicated checks to everything left on my opponent's side. So it looks like we're winding down to an easy endgame, but I'll have to stay wary of that Espathra if I don't want to get reverse swept. Actually, if it's the last Pokemon standing at the end on Greg's side, Tyranitar will no longer be an answer, since Dragon Tail doesn't phase it out at that point. Okay, well, I'll keep that in mind, but for now I do have to bring in a Pokemon with switch disadvantage, but I have a pretty good option with Azumarill. And Greg is going to bring in Chi-Yu, probably hoping to set up a screen for Espathra, if I have to guess, but unless it's super defense invested, Aqua Jet should just be taking it out. Yep, that's Chi-Yu down. And up next, I've finally forced out that Espathra. Now, Azumarill is pretty strong, but I'm going to assume this Espathra has at least some decent defense investment, as they usually do, so I'd rather not take my chances here. I've got a more dedicated answer, especially now that Chi-Yu is down, with Tyranitar. We'll come in on the Calm Mind setup, which makes sense, and here I should be forcing a Terra option. If it's fighting, I should still survive one Terra Blast and then Dragon Tail to force it out. If Terra Blast somehow kills or Dragon Tail misses, I'll probably have to go to Dondozo next for a Terra Dark Yawn, followed up by a Azumarill for play rough on the sleep turns, but let's hope it doesn't come to that. It is Terra Fighting, and Terra Blast, 81%, and Dragon Tail drags it out to Lycanroc. Perfect. From here, I have no problem clicking Dragon Tail until I go down. Lycanroc will generously take Tyranitar out on this next turn with a close combat, and now it kind of looks like Azumarill can clean this game up. Aqua Jet for this, obviously, after taking the Accelerock, and that takes out the rest of Lycanroc's health. 5-1 game, and now it is just Azumarill versus Terra Fighting Espathra. And I think Greg's only shot here is to set up on a Play Rough miss. I have enough resources left to deal with this, but let's just end this right here. Yeah, Azumarill? Espathra Roost, but that will not stop the one-hit KO from Play Rough to take the game 5-0. Good game to Greg. Meowscarada and Espathra sure do force some careful prep and play, and you did play them well. But just based on the Pokemon, the match really was in my favor. I think, other than my over-reliance on Fortress pivots for scouting, the game plan came together pretty well, with every team member contributing besides Dondozo, who didn't actually touch the field despite it being my primary Terra candidate for this battle. Yeah, I also never terastallized, but that was mostly out of fear of that Espathra, which I think was justified given its setup potential. As for the team, shoutouts to Fortress for tanking a total of 8 hits without going down, Kilowattrel for winning the Meowscarada matchup, and Great Tusk and Azu for the KOs, but I do think Tyranitar is the underrated standout for me. I was really happy with how well Dragon Tail worked for this match, both to punish switches and stop an Espathra sweep, not to mention that special book allowing to take a stabbed fighting move to do its job, as well as that Sand Chip forcing everything to stay into Great Tusk range. So that's it for quarterfinals, pretty straightforward game. On the other side of the Paldea bracket, the Wobbuffets faced off against the Agrons, and it was Steve and his Wobbuffets that advanced to play the Noctowls in the semifinals. This is a rematch happening just 2 weeks after our regular season match, so it's safe to say that we'll both be unleashing some strategies that were probably held back last time. I'm 2 games away from the undefeated season. Let's see how that next match goes. And also, full disclosure, this is going to be a pretty busy month for me coming up, so any more videos on this season might be delayed quite a bit. We'll see. I'd like to get them out soon, but more than likely I won't have that much time to record until after my wedding in June. However, all the matches left in this season will be covered in depth on the Wooper Club League main channel, so go ahead and check that out in the meantime. Thanks everyone, and I'll see you next time.